Welcome to Campus Speaks, Hear Their Story. I'm your host, Doug Magnuson. Today we'll be speaking with Dr. Martha Patterson about her research and books on African American studies. Welcome, Martha. This passion began as part of a research paper for an advertising history course in graduate school. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that project?
The professor sent us into the stacks so that we could actually look at old magazines, and I was really fascinated by the advertisements of women in those magazines. And especially, this was like the late 1900s, early 20th century. And I kept seeing this one particular ideal of beauty, female beauty, that's a lot like our, almost like the Barbie doll today. So she had kind of hair piled on her head. It was very tall, statuesque, with a large bust and narrow waist. That became a chapter in my dissertation and became a chapter in the book that I wrote on the new woman, because this ideal of feminine beauty, it defined women who wanted the right to vote, who wanted the right to be artists and to live independently, to work independently. And so they were often kind of caricatured as being masculine, but then to make their case for the rights of women, they would use this ideal of feminine beauty. So they would kind of perform as Gibson girls so that they could make a case for themselves and for their own rights. And so I was really interested, again, in how groups that have historically been marginalized use these ideals of again, of beauty or of, these kind of mainstream ideals to kind of push for their own rights. And so that's kind of how I got interested in periodical studies.
You've been part of the Hutchins Center Fellowship Program that is run by Dr. Henry Louis Gates, Jr. He's a historian and filmmaker, host of Finding Your Roots. He serves as the Alphonse Fletcher University professor and director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. Can you tell us about how you met?
I actually heard him on the radio on Fresh Air. He was giving an interview, and he was talking about his book, Stony the Road, which was about Reconstruction. And at the end of his interview, he talked about how he was fascinated by the New Negro, because the New Negro, it was both the imagery of it and the rhetoric around it was really an attempt to claim a kind of Black pride in a period of increasing hostility and just endemic racism in the United States. And so the New Negro was, again, this figure that was a figure of resistance to that. And so I heard him and I was like, well, okay, this is kind of a lark. I'll contact him and see if he would have any ideas like where I could publish this. I didn't think he would respond, but he responded and he said, he's like, why don't we do this together? Why don't we put, a new edition out of this reader? And so then when I was out in Boston at a conference, I told him I was coming. He said, well, let's get together and meet. And so that's how I met him.
During your McKendree sabbatical, you discovered an opportunity for another book you're working on called The Harlem Renaissance Weekly. That examines published works in Black newspapers and the New Negro Project, which looks at the history of the trope. Can you explain the New Negro trope and how it has been used in Black and white newspapers?
The New Negro is coined to define generally Black men, not exclusively, but generally Black men who claimed the rights to an education, formal education, to political office, to upward mobility, and to respect, all right, to civil rights, and all the rights as that white American men enjoyed. The trope of the New Negro woman is coined in 1895, just right after the New Woman. The trope of the new woman is coined. Now remember, the new woman is really controversial. The white woman who wants to work outside the home, who may be demanding, access to birth control, things like that. All right, so she's radical. And in the white press, she's often seen as masculine or ugly, as that, only women who no men would ever desire would be out there in the streets marching for their rights. Using that rhetoric was really problematic given the stereotypes of black women that are circulating in the time, right? Because you got the Jezebel stereotype of the sexually voracious black woman, which was used to justify or somehow make to blame black women for white men, their sexual appropriation of black women. I mean, that was used to justify that. Black women really wanted to avoid. They didn't want to claim any kind of trope or any kind of ideal that would evoke that, right? So the new woman was dangerous in that way, all right? And so what they do, and it's so interesting, is they adopt a much more conservative variant of the new woman. And so that's what you see in 1895, is you see them appropriating like the look of the Gibson girl, but, and this is a key difference, she acts much differently than the white version of the Gibson girl. So the white version of the Gibson girl goes on shopping sprees, she's continually desiring, she's juggling different men, right? And the whole idea is within this new consumer society that what men are supposed to kind of indulge her, right? This is the way now women are, right? And we see that stereotype now with women and credit cards, right? We see that's very much a part of American popular culture. But so what black women did is they made the new Negro woman, she was an embodiment of womanhood. She was devoted to the race. She would run women's clubs. She was devoted to uplift, but she was very modest in appearance, always modest, deferential to men, and she always presented herself in a way that was an asset to the race. So she was educated and careful in her demeanor. And again, this kind of conservative variant. So by the 20s, so even though by the 20s you'll see, certainly in the black press, you see black women as chorus girls, and far more, there's far more kind of discourse about kind of claiming sexuality in black blues singers and all that kind of rhetoric. You don't see them using the new Negro woman trope. They're not going to use that language. So they'll use the language of the chorus girl. They'll use generally other language to describe, not exclusively, there's some of that, but generally they will use, what is this what's the new type, or what's, happening, but there's kind of a reluctance to actually use that language of the new Negro. It's really important to consider who uses this language and who does not, and why, because it's used strategically, all right, to combat racism, to present a particular image of not just themselves, but the black community. And so it's always used really strategically to think about, okay, what kind of image do I want to present to the world, and how is that going to combat a particular racist stereotype? The only anthology I found actually was one by Henry Louis Gates and Jean Jarrett called The New Negro, but he only devoted one section to essays that explicitly use that trope. So I put together a book proposal, and I spent months and months researching, I put together this proposal, and then I reached out to him, and he was excited about it, and there we go.
This experience with Dr. Gates has allowed you to expand your work on the complex history of the trope. Can you walk us through the evolution of the figure?
I discovered it was actually coined in 1887 in response to Henry Grady's vision of the New South. He's trying to say, listen, Northerners, we need to come together. We need to kind of forget the Great War, the Civil War, and we need investment in the South. We need technological development, but at the same time, let us handle the race question. We don't need to worry about that, but you can come down. We'll work together. And so African Americans also see this as a time of possibility. Okay, well, if you're going to say the New South, well, we're going to say that there's a new Negro, And their vision of the new Negro is one that's directly opposed to this huge onslaught of racist iconography that appears everywhere in American culture, not just in the South. This is everywhere, where you see images of black men as Sambos, as laughing and joking, or you see them as brute Negroes, or you see them as just, these caricatures of, being eaten by alligators or eating watermelons or whatever. I mean, and so what happens is that black men say, listen, this is particularly black men in the beginning, say, no, the new Negro, as we define it, is one who is highly educated, often has gone to an HBCU, a historically black college or university, who is civic-minded, who wants to uplift the race, who wants to engage in politics, and one who is morally upstanding. So it's very important to keep in mind that it's around 1887 that you have the first, there's really, again, also an onslaught of what T. Thomas Fortune calls the rape racket, meaning all these arguments that black men were no longer under the supposedly civilizing influence of slavery, were now out there attacking white women. And so it became so important for African Americans to present an image of themselves as, again, morally upstanding, that they were hardworking, intellectual, educators, leaders, civic leaders, to try to combat the onslaught of racist imagery and arguments within this dominant white culture that, frankly, the South had a vested interest in white supremacy, right? They wanted to make, having a permanent underclass of black laborers was very profitable to them. And so again, you have, this kind of back and forth where the new Negro is really trying to present this a positive version. So that's the first iteration in 1887, and we see Booker T. Washington in 1900 becomes associated with this a vision in the South. Booker T. Washington, of course, founded Tuskegee College and University, and his vision is one of accommodationism. And he gives a very famous speech, and he says, let us, be like the hand, in all things economic we are united, in all things social we are separate as the five fingers. And so this accommodationism to segregation becomes associated with this new Negro of, again, this kind of conservative vision of the new Negro in 1900. By 1903, it will become, Du Bois will challenge it, and he will argue for civil rights. He said no, he rejects Booker T. Washington's ideal, and you'll have, by 1903 and 1905, with the Niagara movement, a more assertive vision of the new Negro.
Did World War I change perceptions in black culture or in the media of the time?
Before World War I, you had a blockbuster film. It comes out in 1915, The Birth of a Nation. The Klan rides in and kind of saved white womanhood from supposedly the black rapist. And so in response to this, again, we have another vision of the new Negro who is very much, very invested in trying to combat this kind of imagery in film. So you have, like, racist imagery is becoming even more, it's all throughout kind of modern American society in the teens and the 20s. With World War I, the new Negro becomes more radical. Du Bois has this really kind of amazing essay where he says, we go to fight, we come home fighting. And so you had black men parading in the streets, coming home saying, we demand, we have shown our loyalty to the United States, and we demand equality, having fought for our country. country. And so that becomes a very powerful period, but also a period of intense backlash from whites. And so you have the Red Summer of 1919, where race riots erupt throughout the United States. There's competition for jobs, and also this kind of a fierce desire to reassert white supremacy in the wake of World War I, and a fierce resistance against that on the behalf of African Americans. Finally, the last move, and probably the most famous move of the New Negro, is with Alain Locke. And Alain Locke in what we call the Cultural New Negro of 1925. So he publishes what becomes this really landmark text called the New Negro in 1925. And what I find really moving about Locke is that, Locke argued, and he firmly believed that the best way to combat racism was through art. That if you only could prove to the world that blacks were as capable as whites of creating great artistic work, and if whites could see that, then they would no longer, then racism, that would be the end of racism. I mean, he really believed that. And so he believed that, again, you got kind of Negro genius. Like you had to present, you had to kind of prove, if you could prove Negro, artistic genius, then that was the way to fundamentally combat racism. The New Negro is always kind of moving between kind of more conservative, more radical. It's always kind of moving, it's always shifting according to the American climate. And then, of course, today we have a Comedy Central show called The New Negroes. In Obama's presidency, and I believe in this one article he was actually described as a New Negro, so I thought that was interesting, is that he adopted actually many of the kind of New Negro ideology, in that he had to be very careful in his life choices, right? He certainly could never, as a black man, have gotten away with the kind of scandals, both on the marital scandals, the sexual scandals that a white man, as we see in Trump's presidency, has gotten away with. I mean, as a black man, there's no way he would have been allowed that kind of personal freedom, if you will, right? And so, I mean, I think there was very much this kind of weight of having being seen as a racial representative and having to kind of live accordingly, having to kind of, again, always, he always had to be prepared and be very cautious in his speech, and also to be, cautious in presenting, trying to appeal to both sides of the aisle, so that he didn't, so that he was seen as, as less partisan. So in some ways, again, that he's very conscious of his image in a way that you see with the New Negro, and how that image could be used in this continual battle to, frankly, to present, African Americans as fully American, as fully worthy of all the rights of Americans. And I think that he was much more kind of invested in that image-making terrain, and had to be in a very kind of conservative image-making terrain than white men have to be. Even in his physicality, right? I mean, he couldn't be overweight. He had, was in good shape. Everything had to be kind of controlled in a way that you would see with the kind of New Negro imagery.
Thank you, Martha, for joining us today. Your work is very important to understanding the past by highlighting one of the most important vehicles for Black protest, affirmation, and literary accomplishment, the immensely rich landscape of American Black newspapers. Dr. Martha Patterson is currently working on 2 book-length projects: a monograph, The Harlem Renaissance Weekly, African American Newspaper Fiction, 1919 to 1935, and an edited collection of period essays on the New Negro with Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Jean Andrew Jarrett, to be published by Princeton University Press. She is professor of English at McKendree University. For more information on Martha's work, please visit our website, mckendree.edu. Join us for future episodes of Campus Speaks. Hear their story.
McKendree is more than a university. It is the pillar on which academic excellence is built. It is the place you can call home. It is where athletic prowess thrives. McKendree is a place where its educators are dedicated to the success of each student they teach, no matter the platform. McKendree is a community that gives back both locally and globally. McKendree is the place where you can make your dreams a reality. Make it possible. Make it matter. Make it McKendree.